For almost its entire history, the USSR was the most closed-off state in the world, much like North Korea is today. Every Soviet citizen knew from a very young age that the motherland's borders were under lock and key. Ordinary people were not allowed to travel abroad, so they lived in the same Soviet stagnation, drabness, boredom, and a lack of any prospects. At the same time, official propaganda insisted that closed borders were necessary to prevent the vile, greedy, and cunning capitalists from invading and destroying the peaceful socialist state. And this was despite the fact that in most cases it was actually the USSR that was the aggressor. Just remember Finland or Afghanistan, for example. But until the very end, gullible citizens were still being told that the borders were securely sealed, and that heroic border guards were always ready to face any enemy attack. Today, we're going to talk about how the mighty Soviet Union failed to protect its supposedly unbreakable borders. And not from a huge enemy army, but from a single person, the German amateur pilot Mathias Rust. Let's take a detailed look at the biggest failure in the history of the Soviet air defense system. And we'll try to explain why a person without any spy skills or special training managed not only to cross the Soviet border, but also to fly halfway across the country and land. Not somewhere in a deserted field, but right in the center of Moscow, on Red Square. My name is Semyon, this is Mega Show TV. Let's begin. The border is under lock and key. At first glance, the border of the USSR really seemed to be well protected. The security system itself was comprehensive and included both various technical systems and the use of natural obstacles. In addition, the border often ran through difficult geographical zones: mountains, rivers, deserts, taiga, and tundra. These natural conditions themselves were a serious obstacle. Also, in order to reduce the number of people wishing to escape from the USSR, the so-called socialist paradise, all sorts of obstacles were created for those who wanted to enter the border zone. To access these territories, it was necessary to obtain a special permit, and it was issued only in the case of official business trips or by written invitation from relatives who permanently lived in that territory. Dear viewers, if you have ever had to go through the procedure of visiting border zones, please write about it in the comments. We are very interested in the details and your impressions on this matter. A few words about border guards. In Soviet times, the border troops were not part of the army or a separate structure, as in most countries of the world. They were subordinate to the KGB. Yes, you heard that right. The border guards were part of the security service, an integral part of it. This was already a clear sign that the Soviet authorities attached such great importance to border security that they entrusted this matter to the most secretive and powerful organization in the USSR. By the way, at one time the pseudo-president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, served in the border troops. So, formally, he and Putin have been colleagues since their youth. Perhaps that's why they find common ground so easily. As the saying goes, it takes one to know one. Well, never mind. They reinforced the border with air defense, which was essential. For nearly 50 years, the USSR could have started World War III anytime, and without air defense, there was no protection. There was no way to do without it. The Soviet air defense system included both ground-based anti-aircraft missile systems and supersonic fighter jets. Therefore, any flying object, whether identified or unidentified, was bound to be destroyed if it illegally crossed the border. Thus, on the night of September 1, 1983, over Sakhalin, a Boeing 747 passenger plane flying from the United States to South Korea was shot down. According to the official version, the airliner accidentally deviated from its course, entered Soviet airspace, and was destroyed. 269 people died. And the tragedy itself further complicated the already tense Soviet-American relations. But just 4 years later, such a well-planned and technically equipped Soviet air defense suffered a colossal failure, the likes of which has never been seen in the history of world aviation to this day. Who is Rust? To begin with, a few words about the main character. Mathias Rust was a resident of West Germany. That means he was from a free, democratic, normal, civilized country of the Western world. He was born on June 1, 1968. Accordingly, at the time of his famous flight, he was just under 19 years old. Just a kid, really. But he became famous for the rest of his life. That's for sure. Since childhood, Rust was drawn to the sky. He wanted to become a pilot. That's why at 16 he joined a flying club in Hamburg. And when he turned 18, he got his pilot's license. Also, Rust was very afraid of war. He was a pacifist by conviction. This is largely explained by the fact that Germany, divided into two states, was at the very center of the confrontation between the two superpowers throughout the entire Cold War. The largest contingent of Soviet troops in Europe was stationed in the GDR. It was equipped with the most advanced missile systems with nuclear warheads. American troops with their own nuclear weapons were stationed in the FRG. The missiles were aimed at each other, and if the Cold War had turned into a hot war, Germany would have been the first to be hit. Both Germanys, and the German people for the most part, would have turned into radioactive ash in a matter of minutes. But in 1987, the situation was not as critical anymore. A year earlier, Reagan and Gorbachev met in Reykjavik and talked about mutual arms reduction, and also about reducing tensions between the US and the USSR. Just a few years later, this policy would lead to the end of the Cold War and a reduction in fears of a global nuclear apocalypse. For 2 decades. Until Putin, disregarding all the achievements of his predecessors, invaded Ukraine and once again brought the world to the brink of mutual destruction. However, let's go back to 1987 when not a single soul on Earth knew about the imminent end of the global confrontation. That's why Rust continued to fear nuclear war. And he believed that the leaders of the US and the USSR should show more determination in disarmament and establishing good neighborly relations. And they needed to be pushed by some kind of extraordinary and grand event. For example, a flight to the USSR and landing in the center of Moscow. Many years later, in one of his numerous interviews, Rust recalled, "Back then, I was full of hope. I believed that anything was possible. I thought I could build an imaginary bridge between the West and the East and land at the gates of the Kremlin in Moscow. If I could fly through the Iron Curtain unharmed, it would show that Gorbachev was serious about building new relations with the West. How could Reagan keep talking about the evil empire in that case?" So, the rookie pilot's goals were quite noble, to help improve relations between the US and the USSR. There was just one thing left, to make it there alive and unharmed. A flight 1,000 kilometers long. To any rational person, especially one who lived during the Cold War, Rust's idea might seem like a crazy adventure, pure suicide. Deep down, the guy himself understood this. That's why, from the beginning to the end of the flight, he almost turned the plane around several times. However, his belief in the rightness of his convictions, incredible luck, and the blatant incompetence of the Soviet air defense troops allowed him to pull off one of the most unbelievable acts in 20th century history. First, Rust rented a small American-made Cessna 172 Skyhawk airplane from his own flying club. Since this model was not designed for long flights, the young man modified it several times by installing additional fuel tanks. At the same time, he realized that his piloting skills were not enough for such a dangerous journey. Therefore, Rust made a big detour before crossing the border of the USSR. On May 13, 1987, he took off from the airport of the German city of Itersen and landed in Iceland. On May 22, Rust flew to Norway, and from there on May 25 to the capital of Finland, Helsinki. And finally, May 28 arrived, the fateful day. This day was not just sunny, although that was important too. In the USSR, it was celebrated as Border Guard Day. Whether this date was chosen on purpose or it was just a coincidence, Rust never actually said. Which of course gave rise to quite a few conspiracy theories. Officially, the guy was supposed to fly to the Swedish capital Stockholm. In any case, he filed this route with air traffic control and took off at 13:21. However, after reaching the Gulf of Finland, Rust suddenly turned toward the USSR. The air traffic controller noticed the course deviation and tried to contact the aircraft, but the young man had already turned off the radio. When the plane disappeared from the radar, the Finns decided that it had crashed and sent a rescue helicopter to search for it. However, Rust's plane appeared on Soviet radars. 3 missile systems were put on combat alert, and 2 MiG-23 fighters were sent to intercept. The pilots requested permission to open fire, but received no response. Later, this decision was explained by the fact that after the downing of the South Korean Boeing, such orders could only be given by the high command, and for some unknown reason, they remained silent. That's how Rust got lucky for the first time. In addition, Rust's plane was flying at a low altitude and at a low speed, which made it impossible for high-speed fighter jets to constantly escort him. 2 more times, Soviet fighter jets from other airfields took off to intercept him, but with the same result. The pilots did not receive clear instructions on what to do with the intruding plane, so they simply returned to their bases. The second time, Rust was incredibly lucky when he approached Pskov. On that very day, military exercises were being held, so the inexperienced young air traffic controller, just in case, assigned all aircraft in the area a friendly status so as not to accidentally shoot down one of their own. Thus, the German Rust became a pseudonym.
Своим.
For the third time, Rust was lucky when he approached Torzhok. The day before, 2 military planes had collided in the air in that area. Since Rust was flying at low speed and low altitude, he was mistaken for a helicopter involved in search and rescue operations. It's nothing short of miraculous, but his luck didn't end there. When Rust reached the Moscow region, local Air Defense Command had already received information from the border zone, except for the most crucial detail. There was not a word said about the fact that this plane had illegally crossed the border. That's why they thought it was just some amateur pilot in a Yak-12 who had simply gone off course. This had happened before, all the more so because various city flying clubs often held competitions in the Moscow region. The alarm was raised only when the plane entered Moscow's airspace, where all flights, both military and civilian, were prohibited. But by then, it was already too late. No one dared to shoot it down over the densely populated city. Rust was lucky one last time when he approached the center of Moscow and began to descend. After making several circles, barely missing the rooftops and trolleybus wires, he landed on the Bolshoi Moskvoretsky Bridge, and by some miracle, without colliding with any cars, he coasted onto the main square of the USSR, Red Square. There he began handing out his autographs to shocked passers-by, but he was quickly arrested. The journey ended in incredible success. What did Rust's flight lead to? Initially, the KGB did not believe that Rust was just an idealistic guy, thinking he was an agent of Western intelligence services. There were just too many incredible coincidences: border guard day, his rather skillful piloting of the plane, and an amazing combination of various factors. For a long time, no one could accept the fact that an ordinary young man without any spy skills managed to outsmart one of the best air defense systems in the world. However, after finding no connections between Rust and the CIA or any other intelligence agency, the KGB handed the case over to the court. There, the pilot intruder was sentenced to 4 years in prison for illegally crossing the Soviet border, violating aviation laws and hooliganism. However, after serving 14 months, Rust was pardoned and sent back to his homeland in August 1988, where he was welcomed as a hero. But in the USSR, Rust's flight was seen as a massive failure of the Soviet air defense system. It was seen as a sign of a lack of proper coordination between different units and branches of the military, as well as the overall inefficiency of the army's command structure. Gorbachev fired more than 30 generals, including Defense Minister Sergei Sokolov. According to contemporaries, such a large-scale purge of the generals was comparable to Stalin's purges. However, this time, no one was executed. Once again, Rust's flight left an indelible impression on Soviet citizens and gave rise to many jokes that, for the most part, mocked the sluggishness and carelessness of the Soviet authorities. For example, Muscovites joked for a long time that after Rust landed, Gorbachev ordered guards to be posted near all fountains, just in case an American submarine surfaced in one of them. Well, why not? You never know what might happen. Alternative versions. Well, seriously though, there really are a lot of unanswered questions in the Rust case. Or, to be more precise, there's actually very little that can't be explained. Despite the official explanation about mistakes made by the command, who failed to make a timely decision, there are still quite a few alternative versions of varying credibility. The most common of these claim that Rust was indeed an agent, but not for Western intelligence, rather for Soviet intelligence, or at the very least, that the KGB used the guy without his knowledge. The true goal of this operation was to give Gorbachev the perfect excuse to get rid of the old conservative generals who had been appointed back in the Brezhnev era and replace them with his own people. Considering the consequences of this story, this version isn't so unfounded. All the more so because the dismissed minister Sokolov actively sabotaged Gorbachev's disarmament initiatives and repeatedly put obstacles in the way of his reforms. Some researchers also claim that Rust had mental health issues, which pushed him to make the decision to fly. About his tendency towards suicide and, on the other hand, his desire to gain recognition among others, to become well known and famous. There is a theory that the young man made the flight in order to win some kind of bet. In any case, the successful landing on Red Square is the most vivid proof that nothing is impossible in this world, especially when it comes to the Soviet Union, where negligence, incompetence, and irresponsibility were the norm, something that the successor of the USSR gladly inherited. Goodbye, everyone.